Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we'll be covering Chapter 8 of the International Macroeconomics video series. I will be working off the second edition of the Robert C. Feenstra textbook. And in this chapter, we are finally applying the ISLM FX model and looking at different cases. Essentially, the chapter takes a look at the Bretton Woods system, the gold standard, and the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism system in Europe, which was adopted in the early to mid 1990s. And so it applies these models to each of these cases, and it attempts to understand why these events occurred and illustrate them through the model. And so we'll kind of look at some of the key concepts taken from this chapter. As always, I've provided the link in the video description to if you want to buy the textbook. And as always, please like and subscribe to my channel for more videos. Okay, let's get started. So a century ago, economists and policymakers preferred the gold standard. It was a system in which the value of a country's currency was fixed relative to an ounce of gold, and hence relative to all other currencies who were pegged to gold. At its peak in 1913, approximately 70% of countries were part of the gold standard system. So why do some countries fix while others float? And that's the big discussion of this chapter. It's really attempting to analyze, is it better to fix your currency or is it better to just float it? Okay, so here's an illustration of the different time periods between 1870 and the 2000s, and the adoption of floating versus gold standard. And of course, here in the in the 1800s, there's also silver, which was being used as a currency. And you can see that the gold standard was very popular, even post-World War I, where the global economy was in chaos, and so a lot of people had adopted the gold standard. But as you can see, eventually post-World War II, with the strength and emergence of the U.S. economy after World War II, a lot of people pegged to the U.S. dollar, especially emerging markets, and then developed economies adopted the floating system, while others also pegged to the euro, and that's really over here, and that's the Eurozone that eventually came to be. So let's look at this example. And I'm actually a big history buff, and I actually really love this case because it is interesting. And let's actually kind of bring it into maybe more recent terms. So I'm recording this video in 2017. And in 2016, the Brexit occurred, and this was the exit of Britain from the European Union and them declaring Article 50 and them exiting the European Union. So I don't know what's going to happen as of 2017, but I can tell you this has not been the first time Britain has separated itself from the Eurozone. And in this case, this is really what we're going to talk about. So an important stepping stone along the way to the euro was a fixed exchange rate system created in 1979 called the Exchange Rate Mechanism, ERM. Now, the German mark, the DM, we'll call it the DM, was the base currency in the system, as the other countries who joined the ERM unilaterally pegged to the DM. Britain joined the ERM in 1990. Based on our previous understanding, the German central bank has freedom to set its own MS and I, while others need to follow. Okay, so as we talked about before, in a fixed exchange rate system, whatever the center currency is, they have full autonomy. They can choose whatever policy they want to pursue, because it will impact their own currency. But the people who peg to that currency need to follow that central bank's way, right? So for the DM, the British pound and Britain's central bank needed to follow the action of the German central bank in order to really maintain that peg in the ERM system. Now, the story begins in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The reunification of the East and West Germany was soon underway. Germans were willing to see their country united again, so the government increased expenditure significantly to accommodate the underdeveloped half. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall, imagine half of the country essentially not growing and developing for decades. And you have one half of the country which has flourished and economically has performed very well, and then the other has just been left behind technologically as well, right? And all of a sudden this wall falls over and this country now needs to reunite. Well, what does that take? Well, it takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of money from the government, and the German government increased expenditure, to kind of develop programs and invest in infrastructure and all these kind of things in order to really, help reunite the country. Now, in the ISLM model, this increase in G shifts the IS curve to the right, which increases output and the interest rate. And so we talked about that in previous chapters. So the rightward shift concerned German central bankers. But actually, let's talk about this first. So as we talked about in the previous chapter, in chapter 7, we talked about how the IS curve shifts to the right as government spending increases. Now, the rightward shift concerned German central bankers, as an expansion in output could risk higher levels of inflation. They decided to tighten monetary policy, which contracted the money supply and raised rates. So, let's actually understand why they did this. So, they're concerned about inflationary pressures. If the government spending and to reunite literally half a country, it takes a lot of government spending. So it wasn't just a little policy change, it was a significant policy change that really would have expanded output without any reaction from the central bank. And so in order to counteract that inflationary pressure, they shifted the LM curve to the left in order to control output. So they actually restricted the money supply in order to raise rates. Now, I would say Germany, before this, Germany went through some incredibly terrible recessionary pressures. They experienced hyperinflation post World War I, where they were suffering from the reparations that they had to pay out, and so historically they were always afraid of inflation and the risk of inflation. So when the central bankers made this decision, they were very selfish in the sense of them thinking about their own economy and not really recognizing that their policy decisions impacted the ERM system as a whole. So once again, let's just talk about this. So as the IS curve shifts to the right because of the increase in G, the new equilibrium point at the initial LM curve is 3, which is above the initial output at Y1, and it shifts to Y3. Now that increase in output will be matched, looking at the Taylor rule and different macroeconomic concepts, it will probably stimulate inflationary pressure. So what they did is they restricted the amount of money supply, they shifted the LM curve to the left in order to raise rates and keep output at the original level. Okay? Now, how did this impact Britain? Well, two things happen. The FR curve shifts up in the British FX market as German interest rates increase. So going back here, you see that compared to the initial equilibrium at 1, at equilibrium 2, interest rates are significantly higher, right? And so we talked about how the FX market in earlier chapters, if foreign rates increase, the FR curve also has to shift up, right? And so the new equilibrium interest rate, actually we'll talk about point 2 for 2. So, and point number 2, the British IS curve also moves out due to the lower exchange rate, which boosted the trade balance. So you'll see now that the upward shift in the FR curve, and in addition to the upward shift in the the domestic returns, results in a equilibrium point of 2 over here, which is at the same peg. Okay, so this is assuming that the British government and the British central bank authorities keep up with the policy of the ERM system. So in addition to the FR curve shifting upwards, the trade balance also boosted, right? Because the lower exchange rate resulted in a higher trade balance. So there was that rightward shift. Okay, so now the thing is, so essentially when the German central bank chose to adopt a restrictive monetary policy, they raised rates from an initially lower level to a higher level. Now, for Britain to keep, and remember, like for the fixed exchange rate to work, they need to have the same exchange rate, right? Because they're assuming that the rate of depreciation is 0. And so for UIP to hold true, you need the interest rates to equalize. So if the interest rate in Germany increase, then Britain also had to increase interest rates. And to do so, they actually had to adopt a more restrictive monetary policy and actually push output below what their target level was, therefore resulting in a recession. And so they had two choices. They could do that. So they could So choice number 2 was peg and suffer. If Britain's exchange rate was to stay pegged to the DM because of the ERM, they would have to raise rates and follow Germany, which would limit domestic output and eventually lead to a recession. Or choice number 2, and really the risky one, or not the risky one, but really the difficult choice, is choice 1, is to get out of the ERM system and float, right? And so the British central bank would let the pound float in the short term relative to the DM as it keeps interest rates lower than foreign rates. So either they raise rates in order to keep the peg stable and to keep it actually real, or they let the exchange rate float and don't follow the interest rates, okay? And so at the end, following an economic slowdown and after considerable last-minute dithering and chaos, in 1992, in September of 1992, the British government came to the conclusion that the benefits of being in the ERM and the Euro project were smaller than the costs suffered due to a German interest rate hike. So they saw that, okay, if they were to really adopt this restrictive monetary policy and contract the money supply so much to equalize those interest rates, it was just too much. Their economy would suffer such a recession, and following the many economic crises that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s, in the 1990s, they were looking for stability, and they assumed that there would be stability by fixing their rate, and all of a sudden they end up with Germany all of a sudden changing the system and being selfish and increasing the interest rates and being like, hey man, like, what about us? What about the people who are pegging to your currency? We're supposed to suffer because of you and your decisions. And so they decided to leave. Right? Now, did they make the right choice? Well, here's the thing. Consider France, who followed Germany in raising rates in order to stay with the ERM. So France, on the other hand, stuck with Germany. They raised rates in order to maintain that peg. Now, these are 4 different graphs comparing France and Britain. So you have interest rates, and so as you can see, the interest rates were significantly higher for France as they followed, whereas with Britain, they actually lowered and cut interest rates in order to compensate for that kind of exit. Now, the exchange rate movements, all of a sudden you have a significant performance in the strength of the British pound relative to the mark. Whereas France, again, they were pegged, so really that the change of the franc relative to the mark was very less. And it was a kind of deviating around the 0% level. Whereas, as you can see, the exchange rate movement was significant, and that's really because they were floating. But look at real GDP growth. Look at the economic performance. You see France, who significantly underperformed Britain. So in this sense, France, again, because they had to raise rates to such a significant level, they limited their economy. Whereas Britain, them actually lowering rates stimulated their economy, and they performed much better than France. So in this case, did they make the right decision? I mean, the world survived, and they also performed very well during that time. So many economists and people agree that yes, they did make the right decision. Now, there are key factors when really discussing the fixed exchange rate regime choice and whether it is appropriate for your country. And the first point is integration. The greater the degree of economic integration between markets in the home country and the base country, the greater will be the volume of transactions between the two, and the greater will be the benefits the home country gains from fixing its exchange rate with the base country. As integration rises, the efficiency benefits of a common currency increase. Greater economic integration through a fixed exchange rate system. So there's a direct correlation. So if your economy is much more integrated and similar to the base country, then the fixed exchange rate system will offer many more benefits. We also argue that a fixed exchange rate can lead to costs. Our argument depended on the assumption that one country experienced a country-specific shock or an asymmetric shock that was not shared by the other country. So in the ERM example, in the exchange rate mechanism case, what happened is that Germany experienced an asymmetric cost. Britain was not split into East and West Britain. It was Germany that was. And so when they had to accommodate that, that was a risk that really Britain would never have to face. And so really when you talk about the integration of the two economies, in that sense, they weren't very integrated, and therefore there were a lot of costs associated with the fixed exchange rate regime, right? Now, another important thing is similarity. So now we begin to see why similar or symmetric shocks cause no problems when there are similar shocks in both economies. So say, for example, instead of accommodating half a country, Germany experienced a demand shock because they were depending on some export demand from another country, and Britain was depending on the same export demand. They would react in the same way, and therefore they could change their monetary policy in the same way and not really risk that fixed exchange rate regime. So similarities is important. So imagine a scenario in which both countries experience identical demand shocks. Both monetary authorities will respond the same way. So there's no risk in seeing, oh well, I need to keep my interest rates at this level and you need to at that level. No, they would follow the same rate. That's why, because they're similar. Thus, if there is a greater degree of economic similarity between the home country and the base country, then the economic stabilization cost to home of fixing the rate to the base country becomes smaller. So here is a graphical example of that. So you have on the y-axis the symmetry of shocks, and on the x-axis you have your market integration. So as the symmetry of shocks and market integration increase, and as you can see, as you move from 1, 2, 3, 4 up, as you pass this fixed line, economic integration and the fixed exchange rate become beneficial. Whereas if your symmetry of shocks are very low and your market integration is very low, the countries are poorly integrated and dissimilar, and therefore a fixed exchange rate would not be very effective. So reading off here, our theory says that if a market integration or symmetry increases, the net benefits of a fixed exchange rate also increase. If the net benefits are negative, the home country ought to float if the decision is based solely on economic interests. This theory can be illustrated in the symmetry integration diagram and the fixed line. So if you're above the fixed line, adopt the fixed exchange rate. If you're below, you do not adopt it because it's not beneficial. Pairs of countries above the fixed line, more integrated and more similar, will gain economically from adopting a fixed exchange rate. Those below it, which are less integrated and less similar shocks, will not. So probably the most powerful argument for a fixed exchange rate is that it might boost trade by eliminating trade-hindering frictions. Let's consider a study which looked at 4 different types of pairs. So 2 countries using a common currency, 2 countries linked with a direct exchange rate peg, 2 countries linked by an indirect exchange rate peg, and 2 countries that were not linked by any type of peg. They were just floating. And the research shows that it's true. With the fixed exchange rate, so you have the direct peg, the volume of trade relative to a floating exchange rate regime was 21% higher. The biggest one is the currency union. And when you think about the European Union today and the euro, you can see that with the euro, the volume of trade relative, among the euro partners is significantly higher than it would be if each of them had their own currency. Of course, there are trade-offs, but one of the big advantages to a fixed exchange rate system is that it stimulates the volume of trade. Okay, so under a fixed exchange rate, would you find the law of one price and the purchasing power parity, so the PPP assumption, are more likely to hold than under a floating regime? So which is loop and PPP more likely in the floating or in the fixed regime? Well, research on prices of baskets of goods shows that an exchange rate volatility increases. The price differences widen, and the speed at which prices in the 2 markets converge decreases. These findings support this initial hypothesis. So in floating regimes, the price differences are higher, the speed of convergence is lower, and exchange rate volatility is, of course, higher because it's floating. So in the sense of, law of one price and the purchasing power parity, the assumptions are much more true for the fixed regime rather than the floating regime. Okay? So, we've talked about all these benefits, but the single most powerful argument against a fixed exchange rate is provided by the trilemma. An economy that unilaterally pegs to a foreign currency sacrifices its monetary policy autonomy. So the previous example shows this. So Britain wanted to decouple the British interest rate from the German interest rate. To do so, it had to stop pegging the pound to the DM. Right? And so that's really the risk here. The risk is if you are going to adopt a fixed exchange rate system, you have no more control over your monetary policy. And sometimes, especially when talking about stabilization policy, if you feel that your economy is going to, see a storm that, the base country may not experience, then it might not be that beneficial to really peg your currency to that. Okay, so what are the other benefits of fixing? One common argument in favor of fixed exchange rates in developing countries is that an exchange rate peg prevents the government from printing money to finance government expenditure. And, this is the concept of seigniorage, right? Sometimes, there are a lot of developing countries where they run out of foreign reserves, and we'll talk about this in a later chapter, actually. And all of a sudden, where are they going to get the money to finance their bills? Oh, well, just to let the central bank print out that money. Well, of course, if they print out that money and they increase the money supply so dramatically, then inflation and hyperinflation will take over. And so the fixed exchange rate prevents that because, you can't control your money supply under a fixed exchange rate. So you limit your ability to really kind of fall susceptible to seigniorage. So under such a financing scheme, the central bank is called upon to monetize the government government's deficit, give money in exchange for government debt. This process increases the MS and leads to high inflation. The source of this government revenue is the inflation tax, and so it prevents the inflation tax because you are limited by the fixed exchange rate. Now, what about inflation? So studies showed that the fixed exchange rates are neither necessary nor sufficient to ensure good inflation performance in many countries. The main exception appears to be in developing countries beset by high inflation, where an exchange rate peg may be the only credible anchor. So unless you are Zimbabwe back in the early 2000s, or developing markets that are really struggling to control inflation, the benefits of really adopting a fixed exchange rate will not be reflected in the performance of inflation. That's unrelated to really the exchange rate. Okay. So what about liability dollarization? So liability dollarization essentially means, say for example, you are a consumer and you want to take out debt, but you are a very poor consumer, and really no one is going to lend. And say for example, you're from Ecuador, and I am a U.S. investor. No one is going to lend you. Ecuador is a bad example because Ecuador uses U.S. dollars. Say for example, you're a Colombian consumer, right? And you need some money. You're not going to be able to go into the financial markets and borrow money in Colombian pesos. You're going to have to borrow in US dollars because A, I don't really have any Colombian pesos to offer you, and B, I don't want to be able to loan you Colombian pesos. I like the stability of the US dollar, right? And so going back to liability dollarization, external assets and liabilities are never entirely denominated in local currency, so movements in the exchange rate can affect their value. For developing countries and emerging markets afflicted by the problem of liability dollarization, the wealth effects can be large and destabilizing, and it's very risky. So as a Colombian consumer, when you're talking about your wealth, not only is it the wealth of home assets, but also external assets that are priced in foreign currency. And for developing economies, that makes up a larger percentage of your external wealth, right? So suppose there's a small exchange rate. Suppose there's a small exchange in E. So does this affect domestic assets and liabilities? This does not affect, oh my gosh, sorry. Okay, so suppose there is a small change in E. This does not affect domestic assets and liabilities, but it does change the value of external assets priced in foreign dollars and external liabilities priced in foreign dollars, right? But you account for that in domestic terms, right? So when you talk about the change in wealth, the change in wealth also originates from your external assets and liabilities. And so the change in the exchange rate will impact the overall value of that. So consider a scenario where a country has $100 billion in assets and liabilities. Say $15 billion of assets is in dollar, so in the foreign currency, while no liabilities are in dollars. What happens if E increases by 10%? Okay, half of the assets and no liabilities are expressed in pesos, so their value does not change. But the value of half of assets denominated in dollars will rise in peso terms by 10%, right? In this case, a 10% depreciation increases national wealth by 5% or 5 billion because it increases the value of net foreign currency credit position, right? So again, let's bring it back to a simple example. Say, for example, you are that Colombian person and you have loans of 1,000 peso and also $500 US dollars. If the peso depreciates by 10%, the value of your peso loan does not change because you don't have to convert it into anything, but the value of your US dollar loan changes. And because the peso becomes weaker, it takes more pesos to pay off that initial amount, right? So that liability increases in the amount, right? And that's really the risk of liability dollarization. So in addition to the previously covered impact on aggregate demand due to a depreciation in the home currency, exchange rate movements might also affect wealth. So we talked about how a depreciation in the exchange rate might stimulate the trade balance, or an appreciation might decrease the trade balance. In addition, a change in the exchange rate will also impact the external assets and liabilities of that nation. So consumers might spend more when they have more wealth. The consumption function might become, in addition to income, also total wealth, which includes those external assets. In addition, firms might find it easier to borrow if their wealth increases. The investment function would then become not only the inverse relationship between the interest rate and investment, but also the amount of total wealth. So if firms see that in external terms their wealth increases, then they may want to invest more because they know that they're much more well off now. Okay. So thus, to avoid changes in external wealth, the value of their original currency external assets must equal the value of the liabilities. So, in theoretical terms, the best way to protect against liability dollarization is to have an equal amount of foreign assets and foreign liabilities. Right? If not, the country is said to have a currency mismatch on its external balance sheet. So if the foreign assets exceed foreign liabilities and the exchange rate E increases, total wealth increases. So if your domestic currency weakens and E increases, then the value of those external assets increase because you have more assets than liabilities. If you have less assets than liabilities and your currency weakens, then your total wealth actually decreases, right? Because you lose on the amount that you owe versus what you own. Okay? So previously, external wealth effects were largely ignored and poorly understood. Now it is universally recognized that the problem of currency mismatch, driven by liability dollarization, plays a profound role in many developing countries. And so you can see by this illustration over here, the change in real output during crisis relative to the wealth loss on net foreign currency debt, right? So Bulgaria had a significantly higher percentage of GDP. The x-axis illustrates that wealth loss on net foreign currency. So as the country lost more percentage of its GDP, the change in real output during that crisis fell by significantly more, versus if they had less and they lost wealth on the overall wealth, then their change in output would be much less. So that loss in external wealth influences and really magnifies the potential loss during an economic crisis. Okay? And so, we can now introduce the original sin theory. In the long history of international investment, one constant feature is the inability of most countries, especially poor ones, to borrow from abroad in their own currency. So going back to you being a Colombian consumer and me loaning you money, I don't want to loan you in Colombian pesos. I'm going to give you US dollars because I feel it's safe. Economists use the term original sin to refer to a country's inability to borrow in its own currency. Domestic currency debts were frequently diluted in real value by periods of high inflation. Thus, the incentive for creditors is limited. Say, for example, I did loan you that money in peso terms. Well, if this country, if Colombia does experience a hyperinflation period and it's going through economic struggles, then the value of that loan for you falls, and therefore you're better off because you have to pay less. But for me, it increases. For me, it's a loss, because for me, the value of that is nothing. Right now, in my terms, in US dollar terms, it probably lost 50%. Whereas for you, you have to pay 50% less, which benefits you, right? So thus, in countries that cannot borrow in their own currency, floating exchange rates are less useful as a stabilization tool. And may be destabilizing. This outcome applies particularly to developing countries, and these countries will prefer fixed exchange rates to floating exchange rates, right? So by being able to fix your currency, this liability of dollarization is kind of reduced, because now you can say say, for example, Colombia did fix the peso to the US dollar and it was 1-to-1. Well, now you can say, well, you can still lend me in pesos because it's still a dollar. And if the country is really confident in its peg and I'm confident in it, then I can say, yeah, because I know that the value of this is not going to change in peso terms. So for me, I'm still going to have that initial $1,000 that I gave you in US dollar terms, right? So that's why, in addition to the higher speed of convergence and lower volatility, another big benefit for the fixed exchange rate is that for countries who suffer from the original sin theory, the fixed exchange rate will help them. Okay, so the simplest form of an exchange rate fix is the unilateral peg. However, there are more complex exchange rate systems. Examples like the Bretton Woods system or the ERM are all considerations. The non-center country loses its ability to conduct stabilization policy, but the center country keeps its power. The asymmetry can be a recipe for a political conflict known as the nth currency problem. And so essentially what this means is that we already know you have to keep your, as a country who fixes their currency to a base country, you have to follow their monetary policy. So you really give up the ability for stabilization policy. And at the end of the day, there is that political conflict by saying, okay, well, I want as a government leader to kind of deviate from this policy in order to really stimulate my economy. Well, you can't, because if not, then the peg will fall, and that's really difficult, right? So that's really the issue from a political perspective. Now, are these serious problems? And this is probably a section that you want to go through a little bit slowly, but there is a type of arrangement. So there are cooperative agreements that may be the answer to really solving the whole conflict between, oh well, what if they deviate away from the plan and we're forced to stick with that and get in a bad situation. Well, one form of cooperation is based on mutual agreement and compromise between center and non-center countries on the setting of interest rates. The other form of cooperation is based on mutual agreements about adjustments to the level of fixed exchange rates themselves. So suppose the home country, the non-center one, suppose the home country, the non-center one, experiences a demand shock, which shifts the IS curve to the left, right? So that to maintain the peg, the LM curve must shift to the left in order to keep the DR, FR equal, right? So when the IS curve shifts to the left, you can kind of think of the ISLM model. When IS curve shifts left and down, the equilibrium interest rate lowers, right? And to make sure that the interest rate equals at the higher foreign interest rate, the LM curve has to shift to the left to push up that interest rate back to the initial level, right? So assume we now start at this new equilibrium below the home's desired output level. Well, because, say for example, the foreign country, the base country, is not cooperative. Because the foreign country has monetary policy autonomy, they must decide what to do. If they are already at desired output, and if they make no policy concession to help out, this is a non-cooperative agreement. So in the sense of, Germany and Britain, Germany said, okay, look, it's more important to unite our country than it is to support the ERM peg and, to think about your needs. So we're going to do what we need to do, and we're going to ignore you guys, right? So it's a non-cooperative agreement. Conversely, if the foreign country decides to pursue a cooperative outcome, they can lower the foreign interest rate. So the home country can pursue expansionary policy by shifting the LM curve right to expand output. So say, for example, we now start at this new equilibrium below potential output for the home country, and really the initial foreign interest rate is at I1. Now, what if the foreign market expands LM and reduces and shifts the IS curve to the left in order to lower the interest rate? Well, in this case, they would kind of pursue a much more expansionary policy, which risks inflation, but also protects the peg, because now the home country does not have to adjust as significant as before, and so they can equalize the interest rate at a lower level. So a cooperative outcome looking at foreign interest rates is essentially the base country cooperates and helps to protect the peg by lowering that equilibrium interest rate in order for the outside country, the home country in this sense, to equalize rates at a more comfortable level in order to expand output and kind of deal with that demand shock. On paper, this sounds great, but history shows that shocks that hit a group of economies are typically asymmetric. A country and its ideal output level may not want to cooperate to risk higher inflation, and that's really what happened with Britain as well, when they did not want to follow the other way, in addition with a lot of other countries and different fixed exchange rate systems that failed. Now, is there a scope for cooperation in other ways? Yes. Countries may decide to adjust the level of the fixed exchange rate at a particular point in time. So consider the previous example where the country is pegged to the US dollar. Under a cooperative agreement, the home country could devalue its peg to a higher E. In doing so, the IS curve shifts right, so the trade balance grows, which then must be counteracted by a LM shift rightwards to keep rates the same. So what happens is that, say for example, again, we start with the home country at 0.1, right, and they're below ideal output, whereas the foreign country, the base country, is at Y0, so at ideal output. Now, if they readjust the fixed exchange rate at a higher E, what occurs is the trade balance expands. So the IS curve shifts right, and then for the non-center country, they also expand the LM curve to make that adjustment to equalize at that interest rate. And so it helps them push towards a closer, more ideal output. But on the other hand, the foreign country would have to suffer. So for them, by raising the E, the fixed exchange rate, they suffer an output loss, and so output drops for them. And as you can imagine, the incentive for that, especially for a country that might be suffering before, is very low. So they probably won't do that. But if they're very, very, close and they feel that this peg is incredibly important, then this is another cooperative agreement that can be made. So not only can a country in a cooperative agreement sense adjust policy, but they can also change the fixed level of the exchange rate. So talking about the gold standard, and we introduced it at the beginning of this video, the period from 1870 to 1914 was the first era of globalization, with increasingly large flows of trade, capital, and people between countries. As the volume of trade and other economic transactions between nations increased, there will be more to gain from adopting a fixed exchange rate. Once gold has been adopted in several countries, the benefits of adoption increase, and that's referred to as the snowball effect. The support of the gold standard fell during World War I as war required financing, right? So as government, the IS curve needed to shift to the right because governments needed to spend more to finance for the war, and so they needed to move off the gold standard. The inflation tax So the inflation tax occurred and came from the central bank financing the government's budget deficit, which implied that the country needed to exit the gold standard. So post-World War II, the Great Depression undermined the stability argument for pegging to gold as more domestic economic fluctuations were seen. So a decrease in similarity across countries reduced the incentive for fixing the exchange rate. And really post-World War II, eventually, the strength of the U.S. dollar emerged and the Bretton Woods system became true. So the international monetary system of the 1930s was utterly chaotic. Allied economy policymakers gathered in the U.S. to try to ensure the post-war economy would fare better. The trilemma was resolved in favor of the exchange rate stability to encourage the rebuilding of trade. So they decided to go back to a fixed exchange rate system, but instead of the gold standard, they came up with the Bretton Woods standards. And so countries would peg to the U.S. dollar, which in turn would peg to the gold, which was at a fixed price. So essentially it was kind of like a gold standard. The U.S. dollar would peg to the gold, but other countries would peg to the U.S. dollar. The Bretton Woods system, of course, seeing that, as always, there are different economic incentives, the Bretton Woods system collapsed from 1971 to 1973, and several outcomes arose. Most advanced countries opted to float and preserve monetary policy autonomy. A group of European countries decided to try to preserve a fixed exchange rate system among themselves, and that was the ERM system, and eventually evolved into the European Union and the Euro. And some developing countries have maintained capital controls. Some countries have camped in the middle ground, attempting to maintain a dirty peg relative to either the US dollar or more stable currencies. Now, a quick overview before we finish this video. So really the big overarching discussion in this chapter was, what is better, the fixed exchange rate system or the floating rate? So there are many pros to the fixed exchange rate. The trade and transaction costs are lower because your expectation of the future exchange rate is zero because the exchange rate depreciation is expected to be zero. So transaction costs might be lower, especially if you adopt a common currency like is the euro. There's also a higher speed of convergence, right? The price differential is lower from a PPP point of view. The trade volume, as research has shown, is higher between fixed exchange rate regimes versus just floating. And it also prevents seniorage. So it provides discipline for emerging markets that might be susceptible to deciding to really finance government deficits through the printing of domestic money, right? The cons of it, and really the biggest one, is the monetary autonomy is lost. In addition, the questions of economic and integration and similarity are real. Like, how integrated and similar can countries be? Are we saying that the US and Canada are exactly the same in every single way? In that sense, then maybe the fixed exchange rate would be better. But even with Europe, and you've seen it with the Greek crisis and what's going on in Italy and France, there are still a lot of integration and similarity questions that exist. And when you think about it, no two countries is exactly the same and fully integrated. And so there will always be challenges in that sense. The big one is monetary autonomy control, right? By losing that and giving that up as a developed market, that can be very significant because stabilization policy, especially for developed markets, is very important. You see the Federal Reserve and the constant action that it takes in the capital markets to control whether it's bond prices or interest rates to stimulate spending. By giving up that ability, you will become very susceptible. And when you're a very large economy, that susceptibility can be a risk. So that is a huge con, and in many ways, that's why a lot of developed markets stick with the floating regime, while the much more emerging markets that really see these kind of risks and that value these kind of positives adopt the fixed rate regime. Other than that, as always, if you're interested in purchasing the book, check out the video description in the video description. Check out the link in the video description where you can buy the textbook. And if you're interested in some research, I published something on Seeking Alpha, where I kind of study different economies and try to draw conclusions. Oh my gosh, I'm super tired. It is the middle of the night. But as always, please like and subscribe to the channel for more videos. I do apologize near the end. I've become very tired. It's probably my last video for today, but good luck on your exams. And as always, if you do like the videos and you feel that they've helped you, please comment below and let me know. So have a great day, guys.